The auctioneer wanted them gone by 4, which told Effie Hallmark everything she needed to know about how the world had already priced her family. She stood at the edge of the yard in the thin March light with her twin sister beside her, and the two of them watched a man in a wax jacket walk the rows of dead metal with a clipboard, putting numbers to the wreckage of their father's life. Coldharbour Reclamation, the sign still said over the gate, the letters rust-bled but legible, the way their father had painted them 20 years before with a brush too wide for the job, because he'd said a man should be able to read who you were from the road. Below the sign, on a laminated card cable tied to the chain link, someone had already zip-tied the future. Lot 1, freehold yard and contents. Guide £180,000. £180,000. For 11 acres of the Essex coast, a wharf, a crane older than both of them, and the tangle of 40 years of salvaged steel their father had died in the middle of sorting. It was, the man in the wax jacket had explained, not unkindly, a generous guide. The land was contaminated, leaded, oiled, the ground written off by 3 separate surveys. Nobody could build on it. Nobody would want to. The value was in the location minus the cost of the poison, and the poison, it turned out, was most of the value. "We should take it," said Winnie. Effie didn't answer straight away. She was watching the tide, out past the wharf where the estuary opened gray and flat toward the sea, and she was thinking about the thing their father had said the last time she'd stood in this yard with him. 6 weeks before the heart attack that took both parents inside a fortnight of each other, their mother following their father the way she'd followed him everywhere for 35 years, as if widowhood were simply one more place he'd gone ahead to. "You're the one who'll understand it, Eff," he'd said, apropos of nothing, standing right about where she was standing now. "Winnie's clever, God knows, cleverer than me, but you're the one who looks at the water and sees what's under it. When the time comes, you look under it. Promise me." She'd laughed and promised the way you promise things to fathers lightly, and he'd gripped her arm hard enough to bruise and said it again, not laughing at all. "Under it, Effie." "Eff," Winnie's voice had an edge now. "Are you listening? 180. We split it, we clear Dad's debts, and we walk away clean. I've got a life in Bristol. You've got," the smallest pause, the one that had been opening between them since they were 19, "you've got wherever it is you go. We take the money and we're free of this place." He didn't want us to sell it. "He's dead, Effie. Not cruel. Just tired, the tiredness of the practical twin who had spent her whole life being the one who dealt with things while her sister looked at water. They're both dead. What Dad wanted was to run a scrapyard into the ground and leave us his debts, and I loved him. But I'm not going to honor a dead man's whim by turning down the only offer this ruin is ever going to get." And there it was, the shape of the two of them laid out in the cold. Winnie Hallmark, sharp, decisive, an accountant in a real city with a real life, the twin who'd got out and stayed out and come back only to bury her parents and liquidate what they'd left. And Effie, the one who'd stayed too long, drifted, dropped out of the thing she'd been so good at that the dropout was still talked about, and come home to a dead yard by the sea because she had, when it came to it, nowhere else that felt like anywhere. On paper, Winnie was right about all of it. On paper, Effie had nothing to set against £180,000, but a bruise a dead man had left on her arm, and a sentence about looking under the water. But Effie Hallmark had a thing she had never told her sister, and had never told anyone, because the last time she'd told anyone the truth about what she could do, it had ended her career and very nearly her life. And the thing was this: she knew what was under the water, not vaguely, not as a feeling. She knew, to a probability she'd have staked her life on, exactly what her father had spent the last 12 years of his life quietly, patiently, secretly doing at the far end of the yard where the tidal channel ran deep against the wharf. And she knew that it was worth, conservatively, several £100 million, and that it was the reason he'd told her to look under it. And the reason a man who owned 11 contaminated acres had died with debts he could have cleared in an afternoon if he'd ever once been willing to tell the world what he'd found. She just needed to not sell the yard before 4 o'clock. "Give me a week," Effie said. Winnie laughed, short and disbelieving. "A week for what?" "To look at something. Before we sign anything." Effie turned from the water and faced her sister, and something in her face must have been new because Winnie's own expression flickered. "Win, I have never once asked you for anything since we were 19. Not money, not help, not the benefit of the doubt. I know what you think of me. I know what everyone thinks of me, the twin who threw it all away. You've earned the right to think it. I gave you the evidence myself, but I'm asking you now. 1 week. Don't sign. If I'm wrong, we sell, and I'll drive you to the solicitors myself and never mention Dad's whims again as long as I live." She took a breath. "But I'm not wrong." "About what?" Winnie's arms had folded. "What is there to be right about? It's a poisoned scrapyard, Effie. Dad sorted rusty metal for 40 years and died broke. There's no mystery. There's just a mess he left and a man with a clipboard offering to take it off our hands." And Effie almost told her. Stood there in the March wind with the auctioneer 40 feet away and her twin sister in front of her, and the whole truth rising in her throat. "There's a ship under our wharf. Win. There's been a ship under our wharf since before we were born, and Dad found her when we were 23, and he's been protecting her ever since." And she swallowed it. Because Winnie would not believe her. Winnie had spent 16 years watching Effie be unreliable, and a claim like that, unbacked, would sound exactly like every other thing that had gone wrong with her sister. If Effie was going to say it, she had to be able to prove it in the same breath, and she couldn't, not yet, not standing on the bank. She had to go under it first. Her father had chosen the word deliberately. Under it. He'd known his daughters. He'd known that Winnie would need proof and Effie would need to earn back the right to be believed, and he'd hidden the truth in the one place only the twin who looked at water would ever think to go. "Just a week," Effie said, "please." The man in the wax jacket was walking back toward them now, clipboard against his chest, apology already arranging his face, because the numbers had come in even lower than the guide, and he had that to deliver on top of everything else. Behind him, through the gate, a car was pulling into the lane, a good car, quiet and dark and expensive, entirely wrong for a poisoned yard on the Essex marsh, and Effie watched it stop, and watched a man get out, and felt the day tilt under her the way a deck tilts when the tide turns beneath it. She knew him, 16 years older, gone gray and prosperous and smooth, but she knew him, and the knowing went through her like cold water. Winnie knew him too. Effie heard her sister's breath change. "Is that," Winnie started. "Marcus Kentridge," Effie said quietly. He had been their father's partner once. Long ago, before the twins were born, when Coldharbour Reclamation had been 2 young men and a borrowed crane, and a dream about the money that lay in the mud of the estuary. Because their father and Marcus Kentridge had started as marine salvage men, divers, wreck hunters, before it all went wrong and split them, and left their father sorting scrap on land for 40 years while Kentridge went off and became the thing he'd become. Effie's father had never told his daughters the whole of what had happened between them. He'd only ever said one thing about Marcus Kentridge, once, with a face Effie had never seen him wear before or since. "That man took something from your mother and me that we never got back," he'd said. "And one day he'll come sniffing round this yard because he's always known there was more here than metal. When he does, you keep him off the water, Effie. Whatever else you do, you keep Marcus Kentridge off my water." And here he was, on the very day the yard went up for sale, getting out of an expensive car with an expensive smile, walking toward the 2 orphaned daughters of the man he'd betrayed, on the marsh where the tide was turning, 6 weeks after a promise made across a bruise. Kentridge stopped a few feet away. Up close the years had been kind to him in all the ways they hadn't been kind to their father. He looked from one twin to the other, and his smile widened, and Effie saw it reach everywhere on his face except his eyes. "Good Lord," he said, "the Hallmark girls all grown." His gaze settled, and Effie noted it, filed it the way she filed everything. It settled on her, on Effie, not on Winnie the accountant with the head for figures, on the twin who looked at water, as if he too knew which one of them was the danger. I was so terribly sorry to hear about your father. Bill was, well, there was no one like him. He glanced past them, down the yard, toward the wharf and the deep channel and the gray water sliding over whatever it slid over. I heard the yard was coming up, thought I'd pay my respects, and, the smile again, smooth as old steel, see if there was any way an old friend of the family might help. I'd hate to see Bill's place go to some developer who didn't understand it. His eyes came back to Effie. I understand this place. Better than anyone living, I should think. I'd give you a very fair price, well over the guide, today if you like. Cash and no fuss, and you two lovely girls need never think about Coldharbour again. We're considering our options, Effie said, before Winnie could open her mouth, and she felt her sister turn to stare at her. Of course, Kentridge inclined his head. Take your time. But something had moved behind his eyes at considering our options, some quick recalculation, and Effie understood that he had come here today certain it would be easy, 2 grieving daughters, a worthless yard, a generous check, and had just discovered it might not be. Only, he added lightly, turning back toward his car, the tides are getting bigger this month, spring tides. You'll want to be careful down by that old wharf if you go poking about. The channel's deeper than it looks. He smiled once more at Effie alone. Your father always said so. He got into his expensive car and drove away, and the auctioneer arrived with his apologetic numbers, and Winnie was saying something, urgent and low, about how they should snap Kentridge's offer up before he changed his mind. Over the guide, cash today, are you mad, Effie, what options? We don't have options. But Effie wasn't listening. She was watching the dark car recede down the lane and turning one sentence over and over in the cold machine of her mind. You'll want to be careful down by that old wharf. Because there was no reason on earth for Marcus Kentridge to warn 2 women off the deep channel by the wharf, unless he already knew what was down there, unless he'd always known, unless the thing her father had spent 40 years guarding on land was the thing Marcus Kentridge had spent 40 years waiting to get his hands on. And the sale of the yard was not a coincidence at all, but the opening move of something he'd been planning since before their parents were cold. I'll take his offer over your dead body, Effie said, quite calmly, to no one, and her twin sister stopped mid-sentence and looked at her as though she'd never seen her before. Effie, what is going on with you? Effie Hallmark looked at her twin, and then out at the turning tide, and made a decision that had been 16 years and 1 dead father in the making. Come back tomorrow at first light, she said. Low waters at 6, wear something you don't mind ruining. She started walking toward the wharf, toward the deep channel, toward the promise. You wanted to know what there is to be right about. I'm going to show you, but you have to see it under the water, Win. That's the only place it's ever going to make sense. Low water came gray and reluctant at 6 the next morning, and the estuary pulled back off the mud like a sheet drawn from something the family had been trying not to look at for 40 years. Effie was already there when Winnie's car crunched into the yard. She'd been there since 5, in the cold, in the wetsuit she'd driven 2 hours in the night to fetch from a lockup she'd told no one she kept. And she stood on the end of the wharf now checking a regulator with hands that remembered the work, even after all the years she'd spent pretending they didn't. Beside her on the boards lay the rest of it, twin cylinders, a dive light, a reel of line, a slate and pencil, the whole quiet grammar of a life she'd sworn off. Winnie came down the wharf in the half-dark and stopped when she saw it all laid out, and Effie watched the understanding arrive on her twin's face in stages, the way it always did with Winnie, logic first and feeling after. You still dive, Winnie said. It wasn't quite an accusation. You told me you'd never, after Portland, you swore you'd never put a set on again. You told me it was finished. You told everyone. I told everyone a lot of things after Portland. Effie kept her eyes on the gauge. Most of them were what people needed to hear so they'd leave me alone. This is the truth, though. Watch the truth for once instead of asking me for it. She looked up. You brought boots. Winnie had brought boots. She stood at the wharf's edge in an old waxed coat and Wellingtons while her sister sat on the boards and finned up and cleared her mask. And there was a moment Effie felt it, and knew Winnie felt it, where the two of them were 9 years old again, at this exact wharf. One twin about to do the frightening thing and the other about to watch, the roles as fixed as the tide. Then Effie fitted the regulator and gave her sister the old signal, thumb and forefinger, I'm all right, and slid backward off the wharf into the black channel their father had told her to look under. The cold took her the way old cold does, like a hand closing. She dropped through 4 feet of murk, then 5, the dive light throwing a cone of suspended silt that she waded out, patient, hovering, until the water settled and cleared and she could see the channel wall sliding down beside her, timber and mud and the crusted anonymous shapes of 40 years of a scrapyard's runoff. She went down the wall the way her father must have gone down it 100 times, a slow, controlled descent along a route that, she saw it now, and her chest tightened, was not natural at all. Someone had cleared this. Someone had spent years quietly moving obstructions, cutting a clean vertical lane down the channel wall where a diver could descend fast and unseen, and had disguised the work as the random tumble of a scrapyard's waste. Her father. 12 years of low tides, hiding a road down to the thing in plain sight, under the one cover no one would ever dig through. Rubbish. At 30 feet, the channel floor came up out of the dark, and Effie leveled off above it and swept the light, and stopped breathing for a second in a way you are trained your whole diving life never to do. There was a ship under the wharf. Not a wreck of the kind the estuary was full of, not the rotted ribs of a barge or the collapsed iron of some Victorian coaster. This was something else. It lay canted on the channel floor under a skin of silt and marine growth, and it was old, genuinely old, the lines of it wrong for any vessel of the last 2 centuries, a high curved sweep to what had been the stern, timbers black and hard as iron with the centuries of anaerobic mud that had sealed and preserved them. Her father had cleared the silt off a section of the hull. She could see the clean-cut edge where he'd worked, tide after tide, exposing a window into the thing and then covering it again so the water wouldn't take what the mud had kept. And through that window, in the beam of her light, Effie Hallmark saw what her father had died protecting. Just rows of them, spilled where the deck had given way, crusted and fused and unmistakable in their shape and their heaviness, and the way the light did not pass through what had spilled from the split corner of the nearest one, but bounced, dull and yellow, off metal that 400 years of seawater had not been able to touch, because there is exactly one metal the sea cannot eat. Gold. Effie hung in the cold black water above a fortune that had no bottom she could see, and the professional part of her, the part Portland had supposedly killed, the part that had made her, at 26, one of the most gifted marine archaeologists of her generation before the thing that ruined her. That part woke all the way up and began, coldly, to read the wreck. Because it was not the gold that made her hands shake on the light. Gold was only money. What made her hands shake was the ship, the lines of her, the period of her, the impossible preservation of her, and the flag of rotted cloth still faintly traceable fused to a spar near the stern. Effie knew what she was looking at. She had spent her whole ruined career studying vessels exactly like this one and never, not once, expected to touch one. This was not treasure. Treasure was the least of it. This was one of the most important archaeological discoveries in European waters in 100 years, and it was lying in 30 feet of poisoned channel under a scrapyard her sister wanted to sell for £180,000. She stayed down as long as the tide let her, and she read everything the exposed window would give, and she took the slate and drew and noted with the discipline that had never left her, and she touched nothing, moved nothing, took nothing. Because the other thing Portland had taught her, the thing underneath all the ruin, was that the moment you take the first object is the moment a wreck stops being history and starts being loot. And she was not going to do to her father's ship what the world had once falsely accused her of doing. Then the tide began to turn, the first faint push of the flood against her, her father's warning in her body now instead of just her memory, and she went back up the cleared lane in the channel wall and broke the surface into the gray morning where her twin sister stood white-faced on the wharf, having waited 40 minutes that must have felt like a lifetime. Effie spat out the regulator and pushed up her mask and looked up at Winnie from the water. "There's a ship down there," she said. Her voice came out strange, flat, the way it does when the thing you're saying is too large for the tone. "An old one. 16th, maybe early 17th century, I'll need more to be sure. Preserved, properly preserved, the way they only ever are in anaerobic mud, 1 in 10,000. Dad found her. He's been protecting her for 12 years. She reached up and gripped the wharf edge and let the tide hold her weight and looked her skeptical, practical, grieving twin dead in the eye. "And she's full of gold, Win. She's spilling it. I saw it, chests of it. But that's not," she shook her head, water running off her. "The gold isn't even the thing. The ship is the thing. A ship like that, intact, is worth more to this country than the gold inside her. There are maybe 3 of her left in the world." Winnie did not say you're mad. Effie had braced for it and it didn't come, and that was somehow worse, because her sister crouched down on the wet boards and looked at Effie's face, really looked, the accountant reading the ledger of her twin's expression, and what she found there was not the old unreliability. It was certainty. Effie watched Winnie find it and not know what to do with it. "You saw gold," Winnie said slowly. Actual gold. Under our wharf. Under the poison. That's why the ground's contaminated. Win, I'd bet anything Dad made it contaminated, or kept it that way, spread the lead and the oil himself over the years, failed the surveys on purpose. 3 surveys, all saying the land's worthless. What better guard could you put on a fortune than to make the whole world certain the ground above it isn't worth digging? She hauled herself half out of the water onto the boards, streaming, exhausted, more alive than she'd been in 16 years. He didn't run this yard into the ground. He ran it into the ground on purpose. The debts, the rust, the mess, it was camouflage. He turned Coldharbour into the most boring, worthless, poisoned patch of the Essex coast so that nobody ever would think to look under it. And he told the one person who'd understand a wreck when she saw one to look under it when he was gone. Her voice cracked, finally, on the last of it. "He left her to me, Win. Not the money, her. He knew I'd know what she was." And Winnie Hallmark sat back on her heels on the cold wharf and was quiet for a long moment. And when she spoke, her voice had changed in a way that mattered. The doubt not gone but shifted, moved off her sister and onto the situation. "Then why," she said, "did Marcus Kentridge stand in this yard yesterday and warn us to be careful by the wharf?" There it was. Effie had been circling it since the moment his car left. She pulled the mask off her head entirely and let the cold air find her wet scalp, and made herself say the thing out loud that she'd been assembling underwater in the pauses between reading the ship. "Because he knows she's there," Effie said. "He's always known, think about it. Dad and Kentridge started as salvage divers together 40 years ago, 2 young men and a borrowed crane, chasing wrecks in this estuary. Dad said Kentridge took something from him and Mum that they never got back. What if it wasn't money? What if they found her together 40 years ago, found the ship, the 2 of them, and something happened, and Dad ended up with the yard and Kentridge ended up with a career, and the deal, whatever it was that Dad got to keep her hidden and Kentridge got to walk away rich and wait." She was seeing it now, the whole shape, cold and clear as the water. "He's been waiting for Dad to die, Win. 40 years. Waiting for the one man who'd never let him touch her to be gone. And the moment Dad's in the ground, here comes Marcus Kentridge with a cash offer over the guide today. No fuss. To buy 11 worthless poisoned acres that he alone in all the world knows aren't worthless at all." The tide pushed harder against the wharf. Out past the channel the gray water was filling in over the ship again, drawing its sheet back across the thing, hiding it for another cycle. "So we don't sell," Winnie said. It was not a question. Something had hardened in the practical twin, some protective fury on behalf of a dead father she'd half resented for leaving them a mess, now that she understood the mess had been a lifetime's careful lie told in love. "We don't sell to him or anyone. What do we even do, Effie? With a 400-year-old ship full of gold under a poisoned yard, we can't afford the debts on, that a rich man wants badly enough to have been waiting 40 years for." And Effie Hallmark, marine archaeologist, disgraced at 26 and resurrected at 40 in 30 feet of cold estuary water, climbed the rest of the way out onto the wharf and stood dripping in the gray dawn beside her twin. And for the first time in 16 years, she felt the ground of her own competence solid under her feet. "First," she said, "we find out what really happened at Portland. Because I didn't do what they said I did when I've never told you the whole of it, and it's time I did. And I think, when you hear it, you're going to understand that the man who destroyed my career and the man who betrayed our parents might not be two different stories at all." She picked up the slate with the ship drawn on it in her own careful hand. "And then we're going to do the one thing Marcus Kentridge has spent 40 years making sure could never happen to that ship." "Which is?" Effie looked out at the water, closing over her father's secret. "We're going to tell the truth about her," she said, loudly, publicly, to the whole world at once. "Because the only thing a man like that can't survive is everybody looking at the same time." They sat in the yard office to talk about Portland, because the office was the one place at Coldharbour that still smelled of their father, pipe smoke gone into the walls, tied tables curling on their nails, the mug he'd died 3 feet from still on the desk where the ambulance men had left it. Winnie made tea on the little gas ring because doing something with her hands was how she listened, and Effie sat in their father's chair, still in the fleece she'd pulled on over the dried salt of the morning's dive, and told her sister the thing she had never told anyone. "You know the public version," Effie said. "Everyone knows the public version. It was in the papers for a fortnight. Rising star archaeologist disgraced. Treasure hunter, not scientist. They had a photograph of me they must have loved, coming out of the inquiry with my coat over my head like a footballer outside a nightclub." She wrapped her hands around the mug Winnie gave her. "The version everyone knows is that I was site director on the Portland wreck, the Signet, an East Indiaman deep water, the biggest excavation the unit had ever run, and that objects went missing. Gold, mostly. Coin, some worked pieces. Catalogued on the seabed, logged in the survey, and then not present when the finds reached the conservation lab. Thousands of pounds worth, gone somewhere between the wreck and the shore, and the site director is responsible for chain of custody. So when the numbers didn't add up, they didn't add up against me." She looked into the tea. "I was 26. I'd built my whole life on being the one who did it right, who touched nothing, logged everything, the one the old professors pointed to, and they took all of that and they said I'd been stealing from my own site." "You didn't." Winnie said it flatly, and Effie noticed that it wasn't a question anymore, that somewhere in the last 2 days her sister had crossed a line and come to stand on her side of it, and the noticing hurt her throat. "I didn't. But here's the thing I could never prove, and the thing I've never said out loud to a living soul." Effie set the mug down. "The finds didn't go missing between the wreck and the shore. They went missing between the seabed and the survey. The catalog that damned me, the record that said these objects existed and I'd lost them, I didn't make it. It was made by the project's commercial partner. The Portland dig wasn't pure academia when they never are anymore. There's never enough money, so the unit took private backing, a salvage firm that fronted the costs in exchange for a cut of anything sellable, all above board, all licensed. And that firm supplied the survey team. Their people logged the finds on the seabed. Their catalog said the gold was there." She held her sister's eyes. "I think the gold was never there. I think they logged objects that didn't exist so that they could report them missing on my watch, so that the real gold, the gold they actually lifted quietly off the books, into their own vaults would never appear anywhere at all, because officially it had already been stolen by me. I was the cover. They needed a thief so the theft could be a story about a person instead of an audit of a company. And I was the perfect thief. Young, sole director, chain of custody on my signature. They didn't lose the gold. They spent my career to launder it. Winnie had gone, very still by the gas ring. The salvage firm, she said. The commercial partner. What were they called? And Effie watched her twin, her clever, practical, ledger-reading twin, arrive at it a half-second before she said the name, because Winnie had always been quick with the shape of a fraud even when she couldn't see the whole of it. They were called Meridian Marine, Effie said, which was a subsidiary of a holding company, owned by a man who'd made his first real money in salvage 40 years ago on the Essex coast, and built it into a licensed treasure business worth hundreds of millions, and who sat on the Portland Project's commercial board and never once in the whole inquiry had his name spoken in the same room as mine. She let it land. Marcus Kentridge. The gas ring hissed into the silence. He didn't just betray Mum and Dad, Winnie said slowly. She'd set down the teaspoon. Her accountant's mind was moving now, and Effie could see it moving, laying the two frauds side by side the way Effie laid two ships' timbers side by side to see if they came from the same tree. He betrayed you 16 years ago, and you never, Effie, did you know? At the time, did you know it was him? No, that was the hardest part, and Effie made herself say it plainly. That's what I've been sitting with since his car pulled out of that gate yesterday. I never connected them. Why would I? Kentridge was a name on a commercial board I barely saw. I didn't know he'd been Dad's partner. Dad never talked about him, I told you. One sentence in my whole life. That man took something from your mother and me. I didn't know the salvage firm that destroyed me was run by the man who'd wrecked my parents' lives before I was born. I spent 16 years thinking Portland was my catastrophe, a thing that happened to me, random and unfair and mine. And it wasn't. It was never separate. It was the same man, doing the same thing he's always done, which is find people who have touched something precious and take it from them and leave them holding the blame. Her voice had gone quiet and cold. He must have laughed. When he saw the site director's name on the Portland board, Bill Hallmark's daughter. He must have thought Christmas had come. Winnie came and sat down on the edge of the desk, close, the way they'd sat as children when one of them had been hurt, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the tide tables curled on the wall, and their father's mug sat where he'd left it. Then he doesn't know, Winnie said at last, that you know. Effie looked up. Think about it, Winnie went on, and there was a new light in her, the light of a practical person who has finally been handed a problem with an angle she can work. He stood in this yard yesterday and looked at the two of us, and he saw exactly what everyone always sees. The dead man's daughters. One accountant, one, forgive me, one disgraced diver who threw her career away over stolen treasure. He warned us off the wharf, Effie, openly, to our faces, because he's so certain we're harmless that he can afford to be almost honest. He thinks you're the woman he framed 16 years ago. Broken, discredited, nobody would believe a word you said about missing gold ever again. That's not a weakness for him. In his head, that's the safest thing about this whole situation. The one person alive who could recognize what's under that ship and identify the wreck and blow the truth open is a woman the world has already been taught not to believe about exactly this. He framed you 16 years ago, and it's still protecting him today. He built the perfect silence around you, and he doesn't even know he's going to need it. Effie sat with that and felt something turn over in her that she hadn't felt since she was 26 and good and unafraid. Because Winnie was right. The disgrace that had ruined her was also precisely the thing Kentridge would rely on, that no claim from Effie Hallmark about a treasure ship and stolen gold would ever be believed, because Effie Hallmark was already on record as a treasure thief and a liar. He'd made her unbelievable once. He was counting on her staying that way. He thinks the frame still holds, Effie said. He's built his whole plan on it holding. Winnie's jaw had set. Buy the yard cheap off the grieving daughters, control the site, quietly salvage the ship over years the way he salvages everything, off the books, into his vaults, and if the disgraced twin ever squawks about it. She spread her hands. Who listens to her? She stole from Portland. Everyone knows. So we don't squawk, Effie said, and she was on her feet now, the fleece and the salt and the exhaustion falling off her as the shape of it came clear. We do the one thing he's built his entire life on being able to prevent. We don't accuse him. Accusation is what he's armored against. He's had 16 years to make my accusations worthless. We do something he has no defense against at all. She went to the window and looked out at the wharf, the channel, the gray water filling in over 400 years of history and a lifetime of her father's love. We authenticate the ship, properly, scientifically, to a standard no one on earth can wave away, not the unit, not the press, not Marcus Kentridge. We document her so completely and so publicly, through the front door, through the proper authorities, that she becomes the most famous wreck in Britain before he can get near her. Because the moment that ship is public, the moment there are academics and cameras and a national heritage claim on Coldharbour, she can't be salvaged off the books. She can't disappear into anyone's vault. She belongs to everyone in the light, on the record. And the only thing standing between Marcus Kentridge and hundreds of millions of pounds becomes a woman he taught the whole world not to believe. Finally telling a truth so big and so provable, when he finished, rising too, that not believing her stops being possible. The twins looked at each other across their dead father's office, and for the first time since they were 19 they were standing in the same place, facing the same way. There's a problem, Winnie said, because she was still Winnie and someone had to hold the ledger. 2 problems. We can't afford the debts, which means the sale doesn't just go away because we want it to, the creditors will force it. And if we can't pay, that yard goes to auction whether we like it or not, and Kentridge outbids the world for it. And the moment we make a single move toward authenticating that ship, the moment you contact the unit, or a museum, or the receiver of wreck, Kentridge hears about it. He has people everywhere in that world. He is that world. He'll know we've been under the water. And then she nodded at the tide tables, the estuary, the whole exposed geography of what they were trying to hide in plain sight. Then it's a race, between us telling everyone and him making sure we can't. Effie nodded slowly. She'd known both problems before Winnie said them. But there was a third thing, one she hadn't said yet, one she'd been holding since the office door closed, and she said it now quietly because it changed the size of everything. There's someone else who knows what happened at Portland, Effie said. Someone besides me and Kentridge. Someone who was on that survey team 16 years ago, who logged the finds that never existed, who signed the catalog that damned me. She met her sister's eyes. I've known where he is for years. I could never do anything with it because a word from me was worthless and a word from him was worth everything, and he'd never have spoken to save a stranger. But he isn't being asked to save a stranger anymore. When? Because if I'm right about all of this, if Portland and Coldharbour really are the same story, then the man who helped Marcus Kentridge frame me 16 years ago has been carrying that around ever since. And a man carrying something for 16 years is a man looking for the right person to set it down in front of. She reached for the phone on her father's desk. The old one, the one with the coiled cord, the one Bill Hallmark had died 3 feet from. His name is Reuben Ashcombe, Effie said, and I think it's time somebody finally asked him what he lifted off the seabed at Portland that never made it to the light.